Wonderful. Good morning to everyone, and welcome to History Matters, and so does coffee. Today, oops, I'm going to just close chat again. Okay, today, as promised on a variety of different social media platforms, we're going to be talking about, in one way or another, federalism, prompted by all the stuff that's been happening in the recent past. It's quite something. So before we get to that, I want to turn to my partner in crime, who perhaps is wearing new glasses.
I had these for a little while, but I don't know if I've worn them in front of y'all before, but
I like them very much. I highly approve. Annie will tell us the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Annie Evans from the New American History Project at University of Richmond. Delighted as always to be with you on Friday. Excited to just delve into this topic because a lot has happened this week. And I know that you guys will have lots of questions, which is great. Those go in the Q&A box. And in about a half an hour, I will be looking for those excellent questions. Keep putting things in the chat, but if you have a question specifically for Joanne about the talk, please put those in the Q&A. We'll see you in a little bit.
Okay. So obviously, I do not need to go through a list of some of the things that were happening on a state level in the United States last week. The most recent and noteworthy one is what happened in Tennessee, where their legislature expelled 2 of 3 people, Democratic legislators, who were protesting or joining in a protest for more gun laws, gun control. They expelled the 2 Black men, and they did not expel the 1 white woman. And I won't, actually, let me say this right at the outset. I'm going to be using what's happening on a state level to launch our conversation today. I'm going to obviously, as always, swing back at the end. And obviously, I suppose by this point, after 3 years, you all know my politics. But what I want to do today is not analyze state level politics as much as offer ways to think about what's happening and evaluate what's happening, and think about how, in the broader tradition of federalism, how that broader tradition might help us understand or analyze or think about what we're watching. Now, obviously, it doesn't take a historian to note the pattern of what's happening on many state levels. And for a while, it's been Florida, and then it's been Texas and Tennessee. And the other day when I posted a post on, I don't even remember what social media platform, and I said something, I might even be announcing this episode, like given what's been happening in a variety of different states or something. And I listed some states, and then people responded by saying, you forgot this one, you forgot this one, you forgot this one. So there's a lot happening with different degrees of severity on a lot of states, most of which is altering either the way in which things work, the system in which things work, the structure of how things work, to give the Republicans in power more power, either now or in the future, or simply making a bold gesture that makes a point. And I called this, again, we should just say some social media platform. I referred to it as performative legislation, because although obviously if it's being passed as legislation, it's very real and has a very real impact, I think the intention of some of these bills is more performative than legislative. The point of them is to score points, to say, look at us, we're standing up for what we believe in. This is great. And the legislation isn't being thought about. It isn't being constructed carefully. It isn't being debated. It's just being decided and pushed and then proclaimed. And again, some of that might be what one might call real legislation. I think a lot of it is performative. It's just to make a point. And the problem with that, as I said on social media in the last few days, is that however performative you think it is, it has a very, very real impact, and in many cases nowadays, on declaring certain people in bounds and certain people out of bounds. And in today's climate, that couldn't be a worse thing or more dangerous thing to do. Anyway, what I want to talk about is the broader idea of federalism. To put that differently, the balance between the national government and state governments, and how that works, or how that's supposed to work, or how this has worked over time, because in many ways, we are now watching state governments, and particularly often Republican legislators or governors on a state level making very strong, seemingly anti-democratic stands. Again, my point this morning is to be less political and more structural in my interpretation, but there's no denying that a lot of what's going on a state level now is pushing people out of bounds, making it harder for people to vote, and any number of other things that, in addition to book banning, we now have just a longer list, and in many ways a more extreme list. And I think expelling legislators, maybe that's an addition to the list that will push things to a different level. We will see. But what's important to note about our federal system, the system of federalism that underlies our Constitution, is that the very things that we might look at and complain today about, like, why isn't it clearer what the states can do and what the national government can do? Why is that? Why are we always having this battle? Why are we always fighting states and the national and states, and who has precedence? And well, part of the reason for that is because the system was designed that way. And that's part of what I wanted to talk about this morning, is the idea of federalism, that there's the federal government and there are state governments, and that they both have power at the same time. That was a deliberately fuzzy and brilliant compromise solution at a particular point in time, when making something national, creating a very powerful national government, would have been highly controversial, and probably the Constitution would not have passed. Because the world at that time, and certainly the United States, the American world at that time, it was local, right? There hadn't ever been a local, powerful, strong national government. The Articles of Confederation was not that government. So now we're creating a new government. It's going to be in some way or another, a stronger national government, which is, again, highly controversial at the time, scary, makes people think of, tyranny, Great Britain, all of the things that Americans had spent many years by that point arguing against, that they wanted their rights, that they wanted the right to local government, that they wanted the right to local trial by jury, all of these things that Americans had been focused on and insisting the colonies should be able to do themselves, and that should not necessarily be enforced from overseas. Now we're creating a government that for some people seemed to echo what had been just broken away from, and for others felt like a power grab, a maybe not quite tyrannical, but a power grab by some to create something more powerful on top of what at the time many people saw as their main government, right? And I've talked about this before, that people well into the 1790s, and then again, actually closer to the Civil War, referred to their state as their country, right? In the 1790s, Thomas Jefferson referred to Virginia as my country. And in part, they mean that just the way it sounds, right? That's in a sense what your state would have been, and even in a sense, your colony, even though you were very proudly part of Great Britain, you considered your colony really your center of being, as far as where you lived and where the power came from. It might be royal officials on a local level, but it was still local. And so in one way or another, imposing this national something over that very localized something was really, really controversial. One of the absolute major controversies of creating the Constitution. And it's, when I teach it, anytime I'm teaching and it involves an ism, I'm always struggling desperately to find a way to talk around the ism, because I think as soon as you utter an ism, people tune out, or it becomes, it means 100 different things. And we see that today, right? I fascism, authoritarianism, communism, all of the isms, socialism, people use them without a great degree of precision. They're just scary isms, however people are using them. So federalism, because it's an ism, runs that risk. But the logic of the Constitution and the logic of federalism was, because it is so scary and because the implications seem so dire of creating a strong national government to the degree that some people, Hamilton and others, wanted, because that was so scary, it was important not to create a purely national government. And if you look in the original parts of the Constitution before all of the amendments, the word national doesn't appear there, and that's for this reason, right? National is scary. Federal is divided sovereignty. Federal suggests that the national government has some sovereignty and that state governments have some sovereignty. And by deliberately, by definition, the Constitution it's not super specific about that dividing line. It simply says divided, well, it doesn't say, use the phrase divided sovereignty, but the idea behind it is there will be divided sovereignty. That in and of itself was an issue that was debated during the Constitutional Convention. Can you have divided sovereignty? Will that work? Can you be sovereign, have to your state and to the national government? How will that work? All of these questions about who has power and how much power do they have, they were major. They were at the core of many of the debates over the nation's new constitution. So it's all about assigning power. And the idea of federalism was a sort of clever, brilliant compromise. I know. Now here, we'll leave a lot of wiggle room as far as assigning power, and that will work itself out over time, different things, different moments, different governments, different issues. Of course, the implications of that and the after effect of that is we are always, as a nation, in one way or another, trying to figure out what should be happening on a state level and in what areas should state governments have power and in what areas should the national government have power. And this becomes, in our current moment, particularly true on issues that involve some of the cultural politics going on right now, that involve voting rights and such going on right now. We're in a moment where that very, I don't want to call it a vulnerability, that wiggle room, there's a lot of wiggling going on in that wiggle room, right? That people are doing all kinds of things. And what's interesting is, and I did this morning, I'm going to come back to this at the end of my comments. When I began thinking this morning about how I wanted to talk about this, and I was trying to figure out the best way to confront the issue. What I normally do is look and see what people are saying about the modern issue that has inspired my desire to look back into the past. And I see what people are saying. And sometimes it's opinion pieces. And I'm going to mention one today that is an opinion piece. So I'm not citing it as scholarship, but I am citing it as useful. I'll come to that shortly. This morning, I kept looking, and it was very hard for me to get a good result from my searches, because many of the things that I was using to search on are so broad, right? State versus national government, whatever it was I was looking for, bad. But when I searched on where is the federal government, Google exploded. That is the question that people are asking about all of the things that we're seeing today. Where is the federal government? That brings us to the issue that I want to talk about today. So the Federal Convention is partly saying, you know what, several layers, 2 layers of government, that'll work best. And now we're at this moment where people are literally saying, well, all this stuff is happening on a state level. Where is the federal government? And there's a lot of wiggle room on the part of what the government does or doesn't decide to do. And that's always been true as well. I want to point to another moment. I talked about the Constitutional Convention. I want to talk about another moment in which there was a national law, in this case, a national law passed, and on a state level resistance, because one of the points I want to make is that we're talking about a specific power struggle now. That struggle has worked in different ways, obviously, over time. Sometimes people are pushing back against national legislation. Sometimes the national government has to confront things happening on a state level. The thing that sprung to mind this morning, besides mentioning the idea of federalism at the Federal Convention, is the Fugitive Slave Act, right? So that's passed in September of 1850, and it's part of the Compromise of 1850. It required that enslaved people be returned to their owners, even if they were in a free state. And it made the federal government responsible for finding, returning, and trying escaped slaves. So basically what the Fugitive Slave Act is saying, and the part that was controversial, is, you know, if an enslaved person escapes to the North has to send them back into enslavement. That was controversial, particularly given that many states in the North already had decided that they were no longer going to be states ruled by slavery. And now suddenly it felt as though the national government was imposing slavery and imposing itself to defend slavery into Northern territories. So now, in this case, as far as the balance of federalism goes, in this case, you have people in the North on a state level, locally, a national law, right? Resisting against a national act. So you had abolitionists, you had free blacks, and an increasing number of Northern whites who in one way or another resisted the enforcement, I'm going to come back to enforcement shortly too, of the Fugitive Slave Act. In some cases, on a local level, they passed, I need more coffee, folks. They passed what were called personal liberty laws, which granted accused fugitive slaves certain protections in the process of the law. Sometimes states varied in the acts that they passed, but a lot of them had to do with offering legal representation to freed people who were being caught up in the Fugitive Slave Act, or people who had freed themselves and were caught up in the Fugitive Slave Act. So in one way or another, here, in a sense, you see the local government responding against a national law. What we're seeing now often is local governments sort of responding to a gap in law, but I'll come back to that at the end too. At any rate, what you end up seeing on a state level is a variety of different trials and situations in which the judicial system beams in and plays a role in determining what happens to people who get caught up in the implications of the Fugitive Slave Act. And I have a couple examples here. I'm trying to decide if I have a few minutes. So for example, let me hit the guy's name here. Well, actually, here's a very specific example of a point that I do want to come back to, if not in the comments, then in the discussion. In 1854, there was Anthony Burns, a freedom seeker from Virginia, essentially galvanized the people of Boston. Someone tried to rescue him, or people tried to help him free himself. And then ultimately, thousands in Boston stood out and watched what they called the vile procession of federal troops and marshals that conducted him back to the waterfront and to enslavement. You had thousands of local people responding. Now, one point I'm going to make here, which is not the core of what I'm saying, but people love to insist on this so much that almost whenever I have a chance to discuss it, I do. And that is, Republicans and Democrats throughout all of time have not been the same. The Republican Party, you cannot look at the Republicans in 1850, 50, 55, 56, and say it's the same as the party today. You just can't. Parties change, they change dramatically, they reverse themselves, they use the same name but represent very different policies. I always say when I'm teaching, there are no straight lines in the history of political parties. So although people like to claim, we're the party of Lincoln, if you look really hard at what Lincoln represented, that's a harder claim to make. So those kinds of claims, and people are very adamant about them, as I experience when I step up and say, no, the Democrats in 1850 and the Democrats today are really not the same. That's true here as well. At any rate, what I want to talk about here in this last part of my comments then is, so where are we today in this new struggle, and having looked up where is the federal government, I came up with a lot of interesting suggestions. I'm going to throw them out. I'm not throw them out meaning mention them, not throw them out. I'm going to put them out there, or as I say in my seminars, like lay them on the table, as a way to create like a spectrum of things that might happen, but I'm not supporting one over another. But it again lays out ways in which our federal system of government has this area in the middle where things are negotiated, debated, manipulated, and then it's the struggle itself that defines the outcome and the broader implications. So one of the pieces that I read, and again, I'm going to mention one or two of these by name. You will be able to go and look them up. One or two of them come from a magazine, Washington Monthly, that is defined as a center-left magazine. So I'm not citing opinion pieces as fact, but one of the things that one of these articles pointed out was that the Biden administration had been doing something that was not really noticed, but that actually could have an impact on the control of how power worked in state governments versus now versus how it might work down the road. And that is apparently the Biden administration, when giving resources or aid to the states, wasn't just giving it to the state government to hand out to localities, municipalities, different cities, different counties. It was giving resources to local governments. It was assigning resources, money on a local level to try and avoid a governor deciding how that money, those resources would be meted out. So in other words, rather than having a governor of one party, and at the moment, there might be Republican governors who had a strong feeling about who should or shouldn't get aid in a different era, that might work differently. But right now, that's part of what happens in places like Texas and Florida. Part of the way, interestingly, in which the Biden administration is trying to get around that is by saying, you know what, let's let people decide more locally what they want to do with those resources. Now, that doesn't mean that corruption is eliminated at all, but it is a way of shifting the balance of power a little in a way that might prevent one person or a very high up in state person from determining things, from ruling against a red governor ruling against blue cities, or you can, imagine, I'm sure, all of the ways in which that might not work out so well top down, but from a local mode also could be corrupted, but has the potential to work better. Another thing to think about, and this gets back to the Trump administration, federal courts, right? I mean, the federal courts, generally speaking, they could weigh in. Now, federal judges are appointed by presidents and then approved by Congress. This is part of why what we're seeing now is part of why there was all of that talk in the Trump administration, because they filled so many federal judgeships. They were pushing to do that, and they were doing it for, among other reasons, this reason, because federal judges have power. They have power to decide what to enforce or not, how to enforce. But one of the interesting things about any system of laws is that the laws are one thing and enforcement is another. And in a way, the enforcement is more important than one might assume. But so federal judges appointed by a president can have a big impact. Again, the question we can ask now is, what are federal judges doing or not doing? If you look at, let's see here, I looked up on the website. Now I might not be able to find it. I looked up the Department of Justice, their website this morning, just to see what the Department of Justice says about what it's supposed to be doing. And let's see here, it says that they are, among other things, trying to protect those who serve the public from violence and unlawful threats of violence, like voting officials. They say that they want to help potential victims understand what behavior is an unlawful threat. and to work with, this is their language, state, local, tribal, and territorial law enforcement to protect public servants from violence and threats of violence. In one way or another, and you can see their language. It's an interesting thing to do is to look up the Justice Department. The language they use over and over and over again, of course, is protecting, enforcing the rule of law, protecting people's rights. The question becomes, what are they doing? How are they doing it? When are they doing it? Who is doing it? And there are many different answers to that question, but the language is interesting to look at and consider because of the implications. Now, there are a number of things that I think you can look at now and say, okay, this isn't just a matter of state government having one view and the national government having another. There are certain things that in this moment really do obviously represent threats to democracy. If you're trying to make it harder for people to vote and not particularly addressing any obvious fraud, since there has never been proven any widespread fraud in our voting process, really. But if you're making it harder for people to vote continually over and over and over again, and making it harder for specific people to vote on a state level, that's a problem that might do with some help from above. If you're looking at, criminalizing protest, for example, that's something that one might think there could be something people from a higher level of government might have something to say. Voter suppression laws, there are just any number of things that we're seeing right now on a state level. And most recently, these two legislators being expelled in Tennessee, that there could be action, there could be statements, a bunch of people online, and I don't know there are, I'm sure, very extreme political pros and cons of doing this, but there are a number of people out there in the world, political commentators and such, that said, why isn't the president or the vice president, why aren't they going to Tennessee and making a statement about how this isn't right? I think there's a lot one could say about that. We can talk about that in the question session. But what's interesting is that in this moment, what can the federal government do? What do federal justices do? What does the federal justice system do? How do we as a nation respond to things happening on a state level that seem to absolutely violate either the systems that are in place or the spirit of the systems that are in place? And obviously that's a complicated question bound up with questions of enforcement, right? If you defang, if you remove the guts, for example, of the Voting Rights Act, and you say, oh no, we don't have any problems with voting rights, you see what happens now, right? So it's a continual struggle. We are in a moment where it's a visual and very present struggle. It's not happening off to the sidelines. It's happening in a lot of places. It's happening at once. And it's happening in a way that's making it clear what the ultimate intention is about some people having power in a seemingly permanent way. If you're structurally changing who can oust attorney generals or any number of other things like that, how the electoral process works, even on a high level, you're making a structural change that could have a really huge impact. So at any rate, my larger point here, put this down, is that as we're looking at patterns and as we're looking at what's happening, I think one thing is clear, and I think the Tennessee incident shows this, and that is, first of all, we need to note the patterns. We need to see what's happening, and I think now everybody is. I don't think they necessarily were, but Tennessee sort of has opened a door. But I also think it's important to speak out, to protest, to say this is not okay. This gets away from the question of the federal government versus state governments and comes to us. Because one of the things that made the American system of government under its new constitution different from other forms of government at that particular moment was the power of public opinion. The fact that people in power were supposed to govern themselves by what the public thinks, by the public will. And in the period that I've studied, the 1790s, it's almost amusing the degree to which people with political power, see, they're looking right now, that people with political power would be asking each other, who's the public? How do we determine who the public is? Because the public's really important. Who are they and how do we know what they think? And I've written before about different ways, hanging out in taverns and listening, looking for who's reading what newspaper, to try and figure out what the public thinks. It's almost comical because they're so earnest about it, but it's making a larger point, which is that public opinion matters. And so part of how I'll conclude here, and then I want to open things up, is by saying, be aware of what's happening, watch for the patterns of what's happening, and then make your thoughts about it heard in whatever way. Speak out about it, organize against it, send support to people in places where you feel that there are some pretty fundamental things being violated. Speaking up, I realize, feels as though you're like whistling into the wind, like whatever, why does it matter? Or sometimes when I'll say that, people will say, yeah, but my members of Congress don't agree with me, so why should I even bother? I think that I understand that point, and probably true that if you say something seemingly, it's not as though your member of Congress is going to say, I've been struck by lightning, I have changed my mind. But when there is loud public opinion on something, it's heard. The question is, what is the reaction going to be? And sometimes the reaction will create even more protest, even louder exclamations of what should be happening, and that matters. So what's interesting, and certainly we should all be watching in coming weeks to see what happens with Tennessee. What I'm fascinated to see is, given, first of all, that you had the initial gun legislation that they passed, hey, let's give teachers guns, that'll solve the problem. And then, so that had created a protest, and that footage has been online. Then you had the expulsion of these members of Congress who stood with and helped organize protest against that bill and wanted more gun control, and they're expelled from Congress. That's gotten a lot of attention. Plus, there's a racial component thrown in, obviously, in which the white woman was not expelled and the two black men were. So you've got guns, you've got democracy, and you've got race. You've got a lot of things bound together in what's going on in Tennessee, and it's getting a lot of attention for all of those reasons. So for all of those reasons, what's one of the important things to look at now is, how will people respond? Because the response, the popular response, I think is going to matter. It has the potential to be a moment when people will get a sense that there's something in the wind, that these folks have pushed too far, and that there will be pushback. But there can only be pushback if people who disagree with what's happening notice the pattern, understand the implications, and speak out. And I will stop there. I've gone way over. I got the part of the reason I picked this topic is because I was so angry yesterday. I thought I was going to talk about, and I'm assuming next week, unless something else explodes, I want to talk about teachers deserve better. And that was today's topic. Annie asked me, I think yesterday, right? So is this going to be the topic, or is that going to be the topic? And I said, well, it might be teachers and it might be something else. So it's not that I don't care about the topic. Teachers deserve better, because they do. That's actually the first thing that came to me before there was the indictment of a president and what happened in Tennessee. That's a problem with living in these times, is that, and I feel this all the time with my podcast, is that we'll decide on a topic and then we'll be like, what if blah, blah happens next week? So when things are happening, such major things are happening at such a speed, even on my small level here, it can be hard to figure out what's happening. Anyway, I haven't looked at the bottom, so I don't know if I saw mug talk, but regardless of whether there's been mug. Okay. Yep. I also want to turn up my.
And we know that you care about teachers, Joanne. I think we have 158 weeks worth of evidence there.
Okay. Thank you.
We know that you care about teachers. That's kind of why I get up on Fridays.
Well, I'm so conflicted about it, because for 2 weeks I've decided not to do it, and part of my soul is like, no. So
But we're
okay.
not taking it personal. Trust me. These other things are also very timely and
Thank
very important.
Thank you. It's hard to make. Okay. This week, I am using a new mug.
Yay.
Salt Lake City. And it is a mug that is presidential. It has all of these kind of slogans
I love it.
for different presidents. And given that we're talking about state government versus national government, and also, although we didn't talk about it, I didn't talk about it in great detail, what do presidents do at this kind of moment? This seemed like a fine mug to use. There was a piece of paper in the bottom of it. It's lurking
I
here.
was gonna say, I don't remember seeing that one at the mug swap, and I'm trying to figure out who gave
It was
that
in a
one.
box.
Oh, it was in a box.
In
Okay.
a box. There's a piece of paper in the bottom of the mug that said, you may not know how to use a mug correctly. Go to this website. And I didn't have a chance to do that before. So I don't know what that means. So it might be a mug with a sense of humor in addition to political relevance.
Well,
But
you
it,
have to put it in the chat next week. We
Oh,
all
wait,
need to
Jenny.
link to see.
Jenny, you are the one.
Jen, do you know the link?
Because one of the things, we'll talk about this in the after party too, but I don't know who gave me a lot of these mugs. I was like, so yeah, if I use a mug and you gave it to me, okay, wait, Carolee wants a photo of the mug.
Yeah, good one.
Okay, you got it.
A great
Okay.
one.
At any rate, excellent. I thank you, Jenny, for piping up, because I'm bad anyway at remembering this, as it is apparent every week. But now I've got all these mugs, which there's no name on them, so I don't know. At any rate, Jenny, yes, the first, you did win, in a sense, the mug lottery for the day. Anyway, okay, so let's open things up.
All right, we've got some great questions in the Q&A. We're going to start with one from Jen. She says, I've heard that there were members of the Iroquois Nation near the Constitutional Convention, and delegates would go out and get their ideas about how their constitution worked. How impactful were their ideas in the structure of federalism?
Okay, so I would say there are two parts to that answer. I don't think there's evidence that members of the convention were going out and asking for opinions from different Native American tribes, but there is an ongoing debate over whether people at the Constitutional Convention were considering some of the systems of structure of Native American systems of government. There are a lot of historians that basically say there is no evidence of that. I'm not going to weigh in on this. It's actually teachers out there asking your students to really research this and see what the two sides say and use reputable scholarship to do it would be interesting. But it's not cut and dried. It's something that is still debated, and there are a lot of historians that simply say there's no evidence of that. But I would say the first part of that question, I'm not aware of anything that would show like literally going out and asking people as happening.
Yeah, I'm putting a link in the chat. There's this fabulous map called nativeland.ca that comes out of Canada. Have you seen that one, Joanne?
No, I have not.
Beautiful, beautiful piece of cartography, but embedded, it's digital, of course, because that's the world I live in. But they have links to all the current tribal leaders. So when kids are doing research, you can contact the people who can connect you to the scholarship. It's a really great resource.
Oh, that's wonderful. Okay, folks.
Yeah, Cece's used it. I've embedded it in a ton of our New American History ones. It's tremendous.
That's
So I put that in the chat for everybody. Okay, our good friend Gloria. Oh, a Tip O'Neill question. Okay, she says, is not Tip O'Neill's idea that all politics is local a democratic idea? Is that statement against a strong central government, or does it support one?
Well, this actually, I thought about this morning, and now I can't even remember. Oh, and I mentioned, I'll mention one or two articles after that I looked at this morning. Some of the pieces that I read this morning that debating this issue were debating about this very fact, which is Democrats, the Democratic Party, you would think is largely a national, and that they want to impose civil rights and sort of impose rights for people from a national level, or help people in one way or another with national programs of various sorts. However, these articles said, is that always the case? No. And if you're looking at what the Biden administration is doing, that's an example of something very different, which is, what, let's let localities do what they want to do. So, I think the idea of the safety net and the Democratic Party, they go hand in hand. But I also think, based on what I said just moments ago, these things can change pretty dramatically depending on the moment in time and the issues at play and the realities at stake. So you can look at things like, the New Deal and all these other things that represented big national government programs intended to have a broad impact traditionally, and that is democratic. But we are in a really interesting moment for looking at that and thinking about that and what that means. I'm not saying it's reversing. I'm just saying, again, partly because of the fraught nature of the moment that we're in, it would be an interesting thing to keep watching for.
Yeah. All right. The next one is from Dave. Dave asks, would not a relatively strong federal government in the late 1700s, right up to today, insist on some sort of Voting Rights Act? If so, what should Congress pass today so the national offices have free and fair elections? And what as a historian would that look like? I think.
Well, I don't think in the founding era and early America they would have passed a voting rights. Voting rights was first of all, there were huge numbers of people who had none. Even among white men, there were some who had them, and depending on property, some that it was more in jeopardy. So I don't think there would have been Voting Rights Act for a long time. We had Voting Rights Acts in place, right? And they were eroded. They were, basically taken apart in one way or another. Pieces were eliminated. So the problem with that is actually some of what we're talking about here, which is, I think it's hard to pass some kind of act and assume that it will always stay in power forever doing what it's supposed to do, given changes in government, changes in politics, and the sort of wrestling of federalism.
All right. Cece asks, if the debate, the difficulties and struggle was so often about power, did the founding bunch, that's a new way to refer to them, the founding bunch, consider any way to run a society without power? That is there a way to be organized in a democracy without power per se, or will it always be a problematic part of democracy? Did anyone consider power sharing in some organized way?
Well, I would say, what was it? The founding bunch?
Founding bunch. I know that might be a mug, Shirley.
That might be.
Blob.
The framers would have said that they did create power sharing, right? They would say, well, we've got checks and balances. We've got states have some power. We've got the national government having some power. Look at that. Like, we've divided up the power. So someone just got bingo, I see. At any rate, so they would say, well, look, we don't have a king, right? We created the system and we set out the process of the system in the Constitution. That's one of the essential things that the Constitution did and does, is set out the process for this division of power and how it works. So I think they would have responded by saying that's what they did. On the other hand, you can say that the Federalists during the constitutional debate and the Anti-Federalists had very different views about power coming down from a national level, right? Hamilton, who always was someone who wanted a lot of power on the part of the national government, during, I think, the New York ratification debates, he's talking about this very question, which is, who has power, what has power, we're scared about power, what happens if this has power, what happens if that has power. Hamilton says, this is a paraphrase, sooner or later, you must give power. Like, someone has to have power. Some people have to have power. And it is, right, the issue. It's the fraud issue. Who has power? How do they have it? What can they do with it? To people like Hamilton, to Federalists, they thought that they could create, or they hoped, or they wanted to create a system that was strong enough, powerful enough, structured enough that it would channel power in ways that they thought would be helpful. There are a lot of if, ands, or buts in that, because obviously if you're creating a system that's channeling things in a certain way, it brings us back to federalism, which is who's being channeled how and what, and who controls the channeling. The thing about this, and some of what I realized when I was reading this morning and getting into more intricacies of the law with the federal justice system and other things, is that if you're talking about legislation, and you're talking about the federal justice system, and you're talking about, and I think often this gets left out of the story, right? Enforcement. There's a lot of technicalities and specificities that are there as legal protection that make it difficult, or certainly complicate understanding how specific things can be done that are legal and acceptable. Like, what is the range of things that one can do at a given moment? Obviously, people who are in the system and it's their job, they know those things. But I think for us on the outside, it can be hard to know what's allowable and what isn't. And in current years, right, we're in that all the time. Back during the Trump administration, we were always asking, wait, can he do that? And the answer would be, well, that was actually a norm, not a law. Oh, that was my experience, even as a political historian during the Trump administration, was I never thought about the fact that that was a norm and that norms can just be violated. Right? And I remember speaking to a historian senior to me, and he said that to me before I said that to him, and I felt much better for it, because I always assume, well, it's naive historian me who's like, I never thought about norms. But if someone who's been teaching for decades longer says, norms, I didn't thought about them that way, that's an issue. But that's part of this whole question as well, as to power and where it comes from and what it has. I see that Gloria just said, I think, energy. If you want to talk about the one word that is most sums up Hamilton's view of what he wanted government to be, energy or energetic. That's the word, right? He wanted an energetic government with all that suggests, some of it negative, right? Hamilton is the guy who didn't have a lot of qualms about calling the military in when there was political unrest. Not so good. But at any rate, okay, I don't want to take us off the trail of where the questions are going.
Okay, we're running out of time. We still have a few more questions. Okay, our good friend Miranda asks, how do we fight the gerrymandering system? Illinois is so incredibly gerrymandered that the legislature has a Democratic supermajority, leaving no room for independent or Republican voices or any dissent or opposition on anything, shutting out thousands of people in our state.
I don't have the answer to that question. I wish I did. I think part of the reason why I don't have the answer is because of the differences state by state by state on their systems and how they work and what you can do and what you can't do. And part of it is I don't know what the national government is capable of doing to alter that in a way that would affect state by state by state. So it's an excellent question I don't have the answer to. It's a huge problem, right? Gerrymandering, poor Elbridge Gerry. And it is Elbridge Gerry, not Jerry. And how Elbridge Gerry became gerrymandering, I cannot tell you. But at any rate, I do not have the answer to what specifically now in the realm of legislation or administration could fix gerrymandering, partly because of the diversity of ways in which it happens and is morphing and manipulated. But it's a huge, important question.
Yeah, I put something in the chat that might help a little bit, Miranda. It's a website called GeoCivics, which of course has something to do with geography because that's how my brain works. But they also have a lot about ranked choice voting. That's becoming more popular in some states. But also we were just having a little side conversation, join the chat, about how members of Congress don't know how to read a map. And that's a problem when it comes to redistricting.
Oh, that's an Annie question.
Yeah, so I put that resource in there. Miranda, I would love your feedback on that GeoCivic site. Okay, Francesca, hi Francesca. Francesca asked, will a state where abortion to be legal be required to extradite a woman from a state where it is illegal?
Wait, I'm not sure I got the question.
It says, will a state where abortion, I think she put be legal, but I think she meant is legal, where abortion's legal, be required to extradite a woman from a state where abortion is illegal. So in other words, if a woman drives to another state to have a procedure that's illegal in her state, will they be able to extradite her?
And that's a question, right? I think it's Idaho, right, that just passed the law that said if women cannot go to another state to have an abortion, which on so many levels is problematic. But can you, on a certain level, can you imagine? I am going to take a trip to another state, and the government, above and beyond the abortion issue, is going to tell me I can't go because I might do something that my government in my state doesn't like. It's so problematic on so many levels. And the fact that it's being considered right now should make your brain explode. But at any rate, again, this is one of those things. It's pretty extreme. So what will happen? What will be the response? Will we have a local response? Will organizations like, I don't know, Planned Parenthood or the ACLU step forward and do something legally that will force this to become an issue that then gets debated? We are waiting to see. If you were not living in the middle of this moment, if you were from another country watching, it would be fascinating, right? Because all of these things are happening, being pushed and slammed and grabbed at in a very aggressive way, and we don't know what the outcome contingency. We really don't know what the outcome's going to be. Even me as a political historian interested in all of this stuff, historian brain, Freeman brain and citizen brain are like way outdoing historian brain as far as my ongoing watching of things. Part of me is always watching and calculating and thinking about history. A huge part of me, a bigger part of me, is just angry, really angry.
Okay, we have a part 2 gerrymandering question from Dave. He says, in Wisconsin, Republicans in the state Senate failed to confirm 180 Democratic Governor Evers appointments. How, in the most gerrymandered state in the union, some people would argue that, are they supposed to hold these Republicans accountable? He says he's emailed state Senate to the point that he doesn't even get a reply anymore. So are they allowed to kind of hold these appointments hostage, I guess is what he's asking.
This gets back to enforcement. I mean, you can look at something that's happening. You could say, this isn't right. And there have been any number of other cases where something like this was tried and it was stopped. So it would be nice if there's precedent that you can point to. But unless you're in a situation where the people with power are willing to step up or are pushed to step up to, I mean, look at what happened with the Supreme Court, allowing the appointment of a Supreme Court justice, right? There are moments when someone just says, I'm going to do this thing, this seemingly outrageous thing. And then what do? Who pushes against it? How do they push? What are the implications of pushing? All of those things have to be considered. And I'm not saying those things should stop the pushing, but I do think it complicates things. There aren't easy answers. There are easy answers seemingly, because holding up the appointment of a Supreme Court justice when there really isn't precedent for that seems pretty much wrong. But how you respond to that and the implications and the legacy of how you respond, boy, does that complicate things. And I'm not saying someone did anything right or wrong when this happened, back when it did, not that long ago, but you can see how that's complicated, even though something like that you could point to and say, what?
Yeah. Okay, Dale has 2 questions. I'm going to try and mash them together for the sake of time. The first one made me laugh. He said, if Hamilton and Jefferson had Twitter, what would be their response within the Twitter character limit to the question, where is the federal government? He also wondered, when did judge shopping begin in history?
I'll go for the second. I don't actually know when judge shopping starts. I mean, obviously, the idea that specific judicial appointments matter a lot is not new, but I don't know about judge shopping specifically. Hamilton and Jefferson on Twitter, man, Hamilton would have a thread of like 800,000 posts. Like,
Hamilton would never keep to the character limit.
The character limit wouldn't matter. He would just keep, and another thing, and another thing, and another thing, and another thing. Jefferson would write something, I don't want to quite say poetic, But that's for the purposes of my not being able to think of a better word right now. Something that's eloquent and poetic and would capture seemingly the spirit of some things that people consider inherently American, but that actually wouldn't necessarily have anything specific that you can enforce or point to. And he could do that in many fewer words. And Hamilton would be very long-winded and very specific. I think that's what would happen. I think the idea of Hamilton on Twitter, that was the first Twitter exchange I had with Lin-Manuel Miranda, was about that. So they were.
Oops, sorry. Kathleen asks, are there other times in history people have been expelled from government for protesting in a similar fashion to what happened in Tennessee?
Expelled from government for protesting. I don't know the answer to that offhand. What did strike me yesterday, what I was thinking about, particularly watching what was happening in Tennessee, was the number of times in the US Congress that, and in the particular case of the antebellum period, Southerners ganged up on an anti-slavery member of Congress. And certainly in one case, Joshua Giddings censured him. And typically if you were censured, you resigned your post and went home. So Giddings censured and attacked in a variety of ways, and Giddings leaves, and then he runs for re-election again, and he's re-elected by some crazy margin. His people were like, oh yeah? And so then he comes back and to the House, and he comes back with a real mandate and real power. And Henry Wise of Virginia, he's the one who always says things that people don't say, and for a historian, that's great. He essentially says, now look what we did. Like he's more powerful than he ever was. And I'm watching Tennessee now, because that's certainly a thing that would happen, would be that Southern slave holding or slave protecting folk would gang up on someone they didn't like, and in one way or another push him out. And very often, if those people ran for office, they would return with power, with support. So that was the first thing I thought of yesterday watching Tennessee. Again, we shall see.
All right, there's like 3 more questions. I don't know if we want to try and squeeze them in. It's completely up to you. Of course, they're all fabulous questions. So,
well, let's try one. We'll see how long it takes me to answer.
Kathy asks, could laws like the Idaho law just be a vehicle forcing the question to go before the Supremes in a way to attack abortion rights in all the blue states?
Yes. Yes. I mean, so when I used the phrase performative legislation, I was partly just referring to things that are like, look what we just did. But this is another kind of a case in which it's not necessarily that people are assuming there will be enforcement, but it will force an issue that could come out in a way that will make people who are anti-choice very happy. So yeah, that there are things that are going to be happening now that perhaps cannot seemingly be enforced, and it doesn't matter, because the point is to raise the issue, push the issue, and then see what happens in the climate, in the current judicial system as it exists today.
Okay, Gloria asked, did Biden distribute local money according to party that was in power at the local level? Isn't that the same as giving it to the governors? Was it a straight line, or did it vary according to the party in power?
It was not partisan. As a matter of fact, so let me see if I think write it down. Okay, I think this is the article that described it. Again, the Washington Monthly is a center-left magazine, and this is an opinion piece, so I'm not like saying scholarship, but it did describe this, what they were doing administratively for this to happen. It's in an April 4th, 2023 copy of Washington Monthly, and the author of the piece is Will Norris, Norris, and in the piece is a link to another piece that was like, the title was something like, what can the federal government do, a little earlier in time. And again, very much an opinion piece. So it has an attitude about what is right or wrong, but the spectrum of things it lays out and the things to consider, I think, are useful.
And I'm sure Tim will have the link for us momentarily.
I am sure.
Yep, he's already got it in there. Of course it
Of
does.
course.
Okay, last question. I think we might do it, kids.
Woohoo.
Perhaps this is just my frustration talking. This is Jean. Our citizenship is at the national level now. We're free to move our residents from state to state. There's no port of entry to check in when we move between states. So the idea that a state can regulate fundamental rights so differently blows my mind. Do you think the founders expected this much variation?
Yes. Well, yeah, and that's a simple answer to a really good question. I say yes only because their norm was great variation. Their norm, like the Articles of Confederation created like little sort of state nations, right? Sort of nation statey things that met together in the Confederation Congress. And the people there were more like delegates than members of some kind of big national body. So I think, variety and different things happening on a state level to an extreme degree was considered pretty normal because it had always been that way throughout the colonial period, which brings us back to where we started, which is why the national government imposing things felt so controversial, partly because breaking away from a monarchy that had been doing that in a way that felt unjust. Well, you don't want to immediately impose a powerful national government, but more than that, because a national government beaming in and imposing things acted for many people in direct opposition to everything that they had been experiencing. And so they were, again, it comes down to power. They were worried about who has power, how they have power, and what happens with the outcome of it. That's why it's the most obvious thing in the world to say. States' rights have always been an issue. The issue of slavery generally checks off all of the boxes we're talking about now. And many historians argue that the Constitution that emerged from the Civil War was quite different in a sense from the one that was before the Civil War, because it enhanced to a great degree the power of the national government. It changed. Some argue that the Founders' Constitution failed and that there was a new constitution born as a result of the Civil War. I won't go into that in great detail, but at any rate, okay, we are over time, but I think we answered all the questions.
We're at the deck. We did it. Yay.
Wonderful. Okay, now let me talk about where we are going. We are now going to head into the after party. What that means is that we will no longer be recording what's going on here in our conversation so that we can be more informal and talk about whatever the heck we want to talk about. If you beamed in through the National Council for History Education website, just stay right where you are and poof, you will be in the after party. If you are on Facebook watching and you would like to join the after party, you need to go to ncheteach.org/conversations, ncheteach.org/conversations, and then you too will poof be in the after party. Particularly this week, I say this every week, that I just want to thank you for engaging in the conversation of democracy here on a weekly basis and asking questions and pondering things and trying to get to the heart of how we understand things. And I am, I sort of adore the fact that we do this and feel it's as important as ever, but particularly right now, when there's so much happening and some of it feels so blatant and the implications feel so sweeping. And certainly for me, and I'm sure many others, it's an emotional moment. It's like I didn't quite know what to do yesterday with the amount of anger I had. This is a really good time to come together and talk about this, to talk about the sort of history behind it in some way, to talk about why some of this struggling is going on, and to note the patterns and to ask the questions that need to be asked and to think about, to frame differently our way of looking at what's happening now. So thank you all for being here at this time when there's so much going on, us wrestling with this stuff together, you asking really, really good questions that get to the heart of all this stuff, and Annie and John making this happen. All of that matters, and I thank you all for that. For those who are celebrating, happy Passover. I should have said that last week. And have a wonderful week. And we will now segue to the after party. Okay.